Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Azure podcast. Today is November 29th, and we're recording episode number 448. We've actually got Sarah Novotny come back to talk to us. We're going to be talking about open source sort of in a bigger sense in Azure this time. Last time she was on to talk about Sonic. But before we get to Sarah, I want to go through some news. I don't have my co-hosts here today, so I'm on my own. Hopefully, apparently they trust me. But going through some news, a couple of key things I did want to call out. First, and yes, we've actually been on this journey for a number of years now. We are getting serious about deprecating TLS 1.1 and moving up to TLS 1.2 as a minimum. You're starting to see more and more services that are turning off support for the lower TLS versions, and obviously the SSL ones before that. There's actually, we'll include the link in the show notes, but there's some really good articles to talk about how you can test your app, test your environment. And we, have started doing this in our services. So if you don't have this on your work plan, make sure it's there. It'll sneak up on you. Sort of along the same lines, this actually came out of some of the documentation for this. I'd never seen this. I thought this was really neat. Qualsys has a group called SSL Labs, and they do this SSL Pulse thing. This isn't Azure specific, but I thought it was relevant to the TLS stuff. They do a survey of the broader web and report, sort of what adoption is, for different versions. Are people using, TLS 1.3? Are they still using SSL 1.0? The numbers were kind of fascinating. I was sort of surprised at how many sites are using older versions of things. The other nice thing is they do provide some tooling that allows you to check your site as well. So again, that's not, it's not like a paid for plug or anything. This was in our migration content. I just thought this was a really neat resource and some interesting data. Couple other pieces of news. One, and we had the Azure Bastion team on a few months back. Azure Bastion is sort of the jump box service that exists in Azure now, and it used to be to be able to access the resources behind a Bastion resource. You had to actually, have access to the portal, and somebody had to give you permission to get in there. Now, administrators can just generate a link, and then you can use the link to get to the resource behind Azure Bastion. Super handy now, is I don't have to give you permission or anything. I just give you this link. I assume it has a token built into the link, and if you use the link, you can get through without going through the portal. So nice and handy. And then the last piece I wanted to call out, and again, this is one we see a lot of support cases for this, but customers want to come in and change the service limits for above some of the defaults that we issue. There's now a REST API that you can use to manage those service limits. We've had one for compute quota for a while. This is expanding it to cover all the various storage and networking, public IP count and VNet size count, all those kind of things. Definitely recommend you check that out. Not that support is not fun to talk to, but all of us, I think, would much rather automate what we can instead of having to loop through humans to do some of this stuff. I do see Sujit joined as we were doing the news. Sujit, before we move over to Sarah, any news you want to hit today?
No, on that last one though, I was wondering from you, how many, what is the percentage of calls that you get are of just about this, about increasing my quotas and whatnot?
There's an entire team that a big chunk of their volume is this stuff. I actually don't know the number. I probably used to years ago, but I mean, there's hundreds of cases a week that come in for this kind of information. And so, yeah, it's definitely going to save time on our customers, to not have to go through that. And again, we're not going to miss the volume either. We can spend it on more interesting stuff, with our customers. But, it's definitely going to reduce volume for sure. It helps us help them, right?
Of course,
okay,
yeah.
great. So with that, let's transition over to Sarah. Sarah, you've been on the show before, but if you could sort of refresh our audience on who you are and what you do here at Microsoft.
Sure. I'm Sarah Novotny, and I lead open source strategy for Azure and Microsoft all up. Now, what that often means is helping take and contextualize work that's happening in the industry and show how it is or could affect and impact business inside Microsoft, and then helping Microsoft understand and develop strategies around what work in the industry can do to add business value for us. So separate from the OSPO, which is very focused from Microsoft and Microsoft compliance and inside tooling and engagement with how we develop software. What I'm often looking at, and my team is often looking at, is what is happening in the industry, whether that's economically or through political policy work or community efforts inside open source that might be useful or a business value for Microsoft, and then how we can be engaged in all of that. So we have a very different perspective than an OSPO.
Yeah, I was going to say, so we've been doing this show for a long time, and when we first started, we used to joke that originally this was called we called it the Azure podcast, but way back then it used to be called Windows Azure. It's now Microsoft Azure, and open source is something that's it's a part of our daily lives, right? That certainly wasn't the case at Microsoft, 10, 15 years ago. It is now. Do you, when you talk about the conversations you have now, does it really feel on equal footing to everything else, or do you feel like you're still, sort of trying to educate us as an organization and culturally as well, or like because you came in from outside, I think, with some open source experience.
I did.
What's it like being on the inside now? Like,
so I'll use a William Gibson quote. His quote is, "The future is here. It's just not evenly distributed." And what I'll do is say the same thing about open source at Microsoft. Open source is here, and it's just not evenly distributed. So it's very dependent on what team we're talking to, whether or not they get the ethos. The AKS team has several developers and a PM team that work exclusively upstream. They work only on open source projects that are a part of the ecosystem, of the cloud native ecosystem, and are doing work that it adds value and brings credibility to our AKS offering. So that team gets it. The future's here, open source is here. And then there are other teams that still are, developing or maintaining something that has been part of Microsoft for years, and they may use open source. So very few teams don't make use, at least, of some open source dependencies, but they may use open source, but they're not necessarily participating or seeing the value of working in the open or working in an industry collaboration where we might develop partners on something that could be very nicely a commoditized building block, but doesn't need to be the space where we're innovating and we're adding new value. And so we could do that in the public, so we're not all building a new wheel, but we can from there go ahead and innovate on top of that.
So the other interesting thing I thought, beyond just the fact that there's somebody that, at sort of your level and your perspective that cares about open source within Microsoft, but, you sit within the Azure engineering organization, but, you mentioned that you're actually have some accountability and some ownership for the broader Microsoft as well. Yep. How does that end up working, where you're sort of sitting within sort of one perspective, but working with a broader whole?
It comes out a couple of ways. Fundamentally, with the broader portions of Microsoft, either we're lined up with an Azure strategy that Microsoft is part of, or we're doing almost consulting work to those Microsoft teams. So, for example, there are Xbox teams that are working within some of the projects inside the Linux Foundation, or looking at and trying to engage with the O3D Open 3D engine inside the Linux Foundation. And working there, they came to my team and said, "Hey, you're the Linux Foundation board member. Let's talk about how this works. How should we approach it? Where are we going to have hiccups? Where might there be challenges? How can you help us potentially engage with our leadership to fund something like this?" And so we have those conversations in the broader Microsoft space. We help sort of smooth and make a cohesive Microsoft perspective across different organizations that might have different needs out of the same open source project. So for example, there's a project that's in the Open Source Security Foundation, which is trying to make signing a lot easier for open source developers. And GitHub is very excited about that and is building it into some of their workflows. This is SigStore. And that's great. And it's bringing, GitHub is bringing value to SigStore by giving a more deterministic workflow and a clear and, like a heavier hand in identity than just a single OIDC endpoint. And our enterprise customers want something very different. So Azure is working on a very different solution in that space. And we know that other portions of our, say, our engineering systems are going to need to consume signatures that look like a number of these different signing tools use. So we're building and working in a standards organization in the IETF on a project called SCIT, which is Supply Chain Integrity, Trust and Transparency, or Transparency and Trust. The T's, whatever, the T's are in some order. But SCIT is looking at what are the standards around attesting and verifying and being able to read a ledger that could have signatures and attestations about a SigStore signature, or it could have attestations about notary signatures. So we're being able to do this synthesis among and around all of these projects through a standards-based model. But that's working with GitHub doing one thing and Azure doing another, and DevDiv with the engineering systems group going, how are we going to handle all of this? So we're looking at this from, and the security team wanting to build the standards work, excuse me, the new security org wanting to build the standards work inside IETF. So we sort of give that whole perspective for the 4 different organizations who might 3 or 5 or 10 years ago had more of a competitive standpoint.
And Sarah, since you've taken on this role, how has the public perception of Microsoft in regards to OSS, being an OSS contributor, a first-class citizen, whatever you want to call it, changed? Because I know in the past, as Evan said, we weren't anything but OSS, right? Let's face it. And we've done a lot of work, through your team to change that perception. What is the current state that we're in that journey?
I think it's evolving. There is actually a generation of people that when we bring up this, hey, mea culpa, we may have had some previous history with open source, that don't even remember that. So we have to be careful when we start with that. But we also have to be transparent and authentic and acknowledge that we were not always the best open source citizens. In that sense, though, we've had a quote from Satya where he says, judge us by the work we're doing. And so a lot of our efforts have been recently to be quietly, competently in the room, participating and engaging, and bringing our years of experience out to groups that can give us an entirely different perspective. We have a tendency to focus on the ecosystem we have always sold to. And with cloud growing the way it is, cloud is 90% Linux first, which means we have to speak to an audience that is completely different than those we have generally spoken to. So I give a statistic. 40 years ago when we started Microsoft, or when Microsoft was started, I wasn't here. When Microsoft was started, it was at the very beginning of a nascent industry. I mean, desktop PCs were kind of new. Yeah. So we could hire, 90% of the top 1% of developers. Like we could actually have hired, and probably did hire, the majority of the best developers in the world. And if you look at the total number of developers we have inside Microsoft today, and the total number of developers in the world, we don't even have the same number of developers as the top 1 or 2% of developers in the world. So we haven't captured all of them. We can't capture all of them, which actually means outside of our 4 walls, or our metaphorical walls is probably a better way to say it. Outside of our metaphorical walls, we have a huge knowledge base and knowledge asset that we need to tap. And a lot of that exists in open source. And those people have a completely different perspective, have grown up on a completely different branch of servers, for lack of a better term, with the Linux first or the Unix first model over the last 20 years. And they can bring us a huge amount of knowledge that can help us be that much better if we can be humble and if we can engage with the community in a way that is leading to the learning culture that we speak about. I had a friend tell me a really awesome quote the other day. She said, we're all getting older every day, as the world does. And she said, I used to pay for my education with money, but today I pay for my education with my ego. So as I go into a room and I learn something new, sometimes it's like, oh, wow, yeah, I thought I knew how that worked. But, ooh, I should step back and listen and learn, because that twinge of that ego going, no, but, oh, yeah, maybe I should listen. So I think Microsoft is in that spot where we're trying to be a much more learning culture, the learn-it-all culture, not the know-it-all culture. And that sometimes costs us little bites of our ego. And I think we're still practicing that.
Yeah, it does amaze me, because I get in my role, I talk to a lot of different customers all the time, and I think that the delta, in the old days, it would be, you might have, I don't know, .NET talking to SQL Server on top of Windows, and if it wasn't within that sort of narrow bound, we were out of the conversation. And that led to some difficult conversations with customers, because we really, they needed help, but we didn't really even have any insight or knowledge about the other pieces. And then now, I was working with a customer, 3 or 6 months back. They were contributing to an AKS open source component that was being pulled in upstream into what we're actually shipping. So they're sort of contributing over here, and we're contributing over here. At the end of the day, it's shipping to everybody. And it's such a different conversation, because they are experts in their little piece, right? They know more than we do in that area. And by, to your point, by being willing to learn from that, the end result is a product that's better for everybody, right? We can leverage the power of that community, but it definitely changes that conversation. I think I love that quote you shared around being open to learning that stuff. We get better together at that point. I think it's a great quote.
We also make use a lot of open source as a partnership model. So co-development with a customer, we can do that in open source in a lot of spaces, or co-development with a number of our ISVs in order to build something that can be part of maybe an open source foundation and then be given a life of its own, separate from Microsoft specifically, although maybe we develop a service around it, or maybe it's a component that goes into something that we're offering as a product line. But it's something that we build together because we have a common need, and it'll be better because we're all working together instead of, wasting the resources to do it 3 times or 5 times and then compete.
Sarah, I work in an area of Microsoft called CSE, Commercial Software Engineering, and we do a lot of code development, like you just said, with customers, right? That's essentially what we do. And one of the biggest problems I have faced is determining, what is, I should say, safe to put into the open source and what isn't. When I say safe, I mean, what might be construed as secret sauce versus not secret sauce. And I'm sure this is something that you have to deal with on a daily basis, because as the Azure teams are building things, they want to make sure that they're not giving away the keys to the kingdom, so to speak, right? So how does, what's the process that you go through to make that determination? And we don't have to get into, I understand there's a lot of legalese that probably comes into play here, but from a business perspective, what are some of the things that you look for to determine, hey, this is something that is worthwhile sharing, or this is something, we really shouldn't share?
Yep. I actually look at this for what is not necessarily should we or shouldn't we share this. I look at it as what is the business value, or what would we like to get from making it open source if we were to make it open source, versus what do we think we could get, what is the business value if we were to keep it secret. So I compare those more than I say this should or shouldn't be open source based on any rubric. So when I look at a project that, I know that other competitors might be having the same problems, but it's not something that's going to be particularly differentiating. So this ends up being a lot of the different infrastructure stuff or some of the underlying pieces. An example might be our fluid project, which is sort of the how do we make how do we allow for web pages to have synchronous interactions so
That's
that you can edit
stuff,
something,
right?
it's the loop
Yeah.
stuff.
Okay.
Yep.
I love
so
loop
it's
stuff.
this,
I love it.
yeah, so that
Yeah.
you can edit a thing the same time I can edit a thing, and we know that this is not particularly going to differentiate us because this is something that has been in the market for a while, but it is something we need to do well enough. So how and who might also benefit from working on this with us? And then what is the strategic value of us working on this in the public? So maybe it's a strategic value of recruiting talent from one of our competitors, or retaining talent because they want to be working in open source. Or maybe it's a strategic value of working on something where we have a unique perspective that can move the whole industry forward. And that unique perspective can also then be shared in a way that garners us engineering credibility as opposed to necessarily direct market share. So, with something like Linux, building out our engineering credibility is one of the things that we need to do. We're known for our Windows skills. Like, we are probably in the top, oh, good Lord, I hope we're in the top 2 places to work if you are a Windows developer. Let's be clear. But we're not necessarily in the top 2 places to work if you happen to be a Linux systems developer. On the other hand, if we're doing more projects in the open around things with Linux, then we're building up that muscle of sharing, and then we're also building up that credibility in order to draw people in. Because maybe, out there we have someone whose, favorite thing to work on is, I don't know, hypervisors. And so they want to take a look at our cloud hypervisor project, which is written in Rust and is now shared through a Linux Foundation project. Maybe that is the thing that makes someone decide that they will consider, being employed by Microsoft or joining us or draws us in. So there are many different reasons that strategic reasons we might want to open source something. And so I look at what could we be moving or benefiting from open sourcing something versus what benefits are there if we keep it closed source. So that's sort of the comparison that I do. And I ask teams to really work through what is it that they want when people are like, I'm going to open source it. Let's just open source everything. I'm like, super cool. Love the enthusiasm. But why? Which is kind of funny.
It is.
I like the answer.
Yeah. I love the why. It is actually, no, I love it. Super enthusiastic. But
yeah.
Why? That's the, yeah.
Love the enthusiasm.
This may be a little bit out of your purview, but I have to think that to some extent the role that you're playing for Microsoft and within Azure, there have to be sort of equivalent people or organizations at other customers out there, or I'm sorry, other ISVs like ourselves, AWS, Google. I mean, they're similar companies, right? Do you have relationships and conversations with those folks saying, hey, we should do this cool thing as a group, or is it purely sort of a one-sided thing?
Yes, we have those. Now, the interesting thing is we almost always have those through another organization or straight up in the public.
So like a standards group at that
through
point.
A standards group,
okay.
Or through an open source foundation, or through or by already publishing something and then having open meetings. This is something that we need to be very careful about, simply because there are antitrust rules. So, if we were to pick another big competitor and have secret conversations or even just one-on-one conversations about how we were going to move something in open source or move the industry with open source, that should be public. Otherwise, we are running afoul of some of the laws there. So those are the conversations that we have. We do have them. We usually have them in public venues. We usually have them in in conversations where we're talking about a specific technology, not anything about the product or the marketing of it or anything. So we really keep it tight to, hey, we really want to update this protocol and we think it might be really useful. And then we move these things forward in organizations that work with us to make sure that we're following good antitrust policies and that we are sharing in an even and collaborative way so that the whole industry benefits as opposed to any side deals or side parties.
Right. So but I think I mean that is sort of implicit in the open source concept, but it sounds like even just the physical act to say, hey, we want to advance this protocol, right? That we want to do that in the open, but it sounds like these conversations are happening. They're just happening in a very open and transparent way. It's not a one-sided. It's always us, right? It's a partnership. Okay, that's great.
It's a partnership. Yeah, it is definitely one of those things that we work to make sure that there's a vision for what we want to be doing. We have some sort of basic tech to start with, and then we start working in the public. Occasionally, these things start as co-development deals with, say another ISV and Microsoft, and then that partnership decides to become open. When we start those, generally recently, we've been encouraging people to start them without the private contracted version first, because there's a mindset that's hard to change if you're having a private set of conversations and private development that is really tough to move out into the open. So pretty much as often as we can, we encourage people to start in the open if they think that's where they want to go. We do want people to understand why and think about what the strategic goal is of it, but we want to make sure that we don't have to go through that shift. I worked for one of our competitors for a while, and I swear that half of my electrons in a given day were spent saying, hi, is there a reason this is being discussed on a private mailing list instead of the public one for the open source project? And so it's a tough mindset to shift. So the more you can start open and the more you can start sort of the performative engagement and advocacy and excitement and trying to drive and draw people to you, the more successful I tend to think the projects end up.
Speaking of that, success, I mean, we had you on so 2 or 3 months back, I think now, to talk about Sonic, and you were super excited because Sonic is, it's really the way to sort of drive cloud scale networking, right, forward. Are there other projects that you go, man, I'm really proud of the work we did to push blah out into the open source? Are there some that sort of stick in your mind? I mean, obviously we don't want you to pick through all your favorite children and tell us which ones you don't like, but is there
all
one
my
or two
children are lovely?
But is there a couple that you're like, wow, that was really hard to get out there, but in the end it was really worth it? Like, what are some success stories in your mind for that effort?
Some of the ones that I think are most interesting and most heartfelt are the ones where it was more of a struggle to show the value, and then people came around to the understanding of why doing something in the open was just so much better. So there's a open source consumption framework that we've just donated to the Open Source Security Foundation. It's called S2C2, and it's the Secure Supply Chain I'm not going to be able to get the S's and the C's properly. Secure Supply Chain Consumption Framework is, I think, what it is called now. And that looks at the way to frame how you're using software and or open source software, and how to make sure that you are doing this in a secure manner so that you are able to, as a company, mitigate the risk of consuming open source. Same risk as taking a dependency on any library, whether you pay for it or download it, but you are able to manage that risk and then be able to engage with the software and update it yourself if you need to, or bring in a patch when you need to, and then keep this downstream, your product, the product that is dependent on it, safe and secure for your customers. So this framework we donated to the Open Source Security Foundation. And one of the reasons that one was really touching to me was because it began as, hey, this is a thing, Microsoft has an opinion, we need to put this out there, we need to be this leader. And while that may be true, all of it, we do need to put this out there, we do need to be a leader in this space, we do want our customers to believe that we have an opinion. We need to do it in a way that allows us to learn and engage with other opinions in this same space, not as the 800-pound gorilla who may have extra gray hair on their back because we've been at this for 40 years, but as a humble portion of the industry that says, hey, we aren't going to have the only perspective on this. Help us make it better. And that took a little bit to get from the, we just need to publish this and make our statement and get some press about it, to, hey, actually, if we go out with this and we take it out to a foundation and we get some feedback on it, and then we move it through a standardization process, that may actually be better because we're contributing to the community. We're building up not only that credibility for Microsoft, but we're also building up that collaboration muscle on something where we know we have an opinion and we know we can benefit from other people's thoughts on it. And we can get all of the things that we wanted out of that initial publication by doing this in the open, and possibly more because we're doing it collaboratively.
That sounds very sort of the opposite to, you were talking before about, love your enthusiasm, but why this sort of sounds the other way of,
we were sort of pulling
you need to
this
ask
one out.
why, right? Let's sort of tease it out, and maybe there's an opportunity here that we were missing. Is it sort of half split between those two scenarios, or do you find yourself tend to be on one or the other? Like, I sort of feel like open source has its moment now, right? And to some degree. So it's cool, everybody wants to do it, but I don't know, what's your take on that?
So the answer is there are two chunks of work that we take on. One is the super enthusiastic, oh my gosh, we really want to, and people come to us and say, can we get your help? And then we work on those because they're easy, they're reaction, they're trying to, or they're reactive, they're trying, people inside Microsoft want to do this. So we help facilitate it and we help them do it in a safe and sane and collaborative way that is a benefit to the community, a benefit to the industry, and also a benefit to Microsoft. And then there are the strategic investments, and the Open Source Security Foundation is one of those big strategic investments, because we know that Microsoft and all of our customers and the whole industry at large are building on top of a whole set of building blocks that are an open source commons. So we're all using them, we're all sharing them, we're all excited about them, but we're not investing in them enough. No one is. So this is, I don't know if you've seen the XKCD titled dependencies. I think it's XKCD 2347. And it's this lovely building block building, build lots of building blocks. And then there's this tiny, super skinny building block just over here holding up like one whole side of something. And there's a pointer to it, and it says, like one guy in Nebraska is actually managing this and building this. And those are the dependencies that are really scary in open source. And so if we as a community are not actually engaging with those commons and helping secure those commons, all of that beautiful innovation and frill on the top of that building is going to come collapsing down. So the Open Source Security Foundation, whose goal is to help secure the upstream of open source, is one of our deep, deep strategic goals. Another deep strategic goal is getting great at Linux, because Microsoft needs to get much better at Linux than we are. We're good at Linux. We've got, but again, the future is here. It's just not evenly distributed. So you can ask particular, engineering groups who work on Linux all the time. They're fantastic. You can walk down the hall, metaphorically speaking, again, because I work from home. You can walk down the hall and ping another group, and they're like, do we actually have services on Linux? And it's like, oh, yes, we do. Yeah. So we need to balance those. And so we've got these big strategic investments. And sometimes those strategic investments are the ones we have to pull projects out more like encouragement, as opposed to the excited half, which is just like, I want to be cool in the open source.
Sarah, one of my favorite open source projects of recent time was the CBL Mariner project, right? That Microsoft released. I mean, it's unbelievable. That's the Linux distro that powers all of Azure, literally. And we just put it out of the open source. Yeah, everybody take a look at this and please contribute.
So Mariner is an awesome example of getting great at Linux. And the interesting thing that I love to throw out as a statistic is that's not our only Linux distribution. Sonic is another one. I mentioned this on the Sonic podcast. We have two more one that is a container optimized operating system. This is Flatcar Linux, which is sort of the successor to CoreOS. And then we have a special IoT sort of Linux
for
that
Sphere,
is
right?
That is for Sphere, exactly. Yeah. And then there are, I think, two more. One for a particular SOC that we are using, and then there's another one that I can never quite remember. But we have at least 6 different internal and external and public open source distributions that we develop for open source Linux distributions that we develop for our use cases and to publish publicly. But Mariner is a great example. We're building out something, we're exercising our capabilities in this, we're learning as we go, and we've now allowed it as a container OS on AKS. It's one of the drop-down options when you build
I didn't know that. That's new.
Yeah.
That's nice. Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, that was recently. Yeah, that's amazing that you can have that lightweight Linux, for your container. It's amazing. Awesome. Yeah. Well, this is a really great. What a great insight into the way Azure and Microsoft does OSS. Thanks so much, Sarah.
Yeah, thanks,
I'm
Sarah.
happy to be here. Yeah.
Anything last you want to leave the audience with?
I want to go back to the Satya quote. Judge us on how we're doing now and hold us accountable to that. So please, if we're not doing this well, if we're not hearing something, and we need to be hearing feedback, you can find me on the internet. It's not hard. But do something to give us feedback. Let us know, because we really are working to be better at open source, to engage better at open source, and to be a good industry partner across all of the work that we do.
That's great. No, such a different message than 10, 15 years ago.
Yeah.
but it's the right message, right? So it's a great one. So awesome.
10 to
great.
15 years ago, I wouldn't have worked at Microsoft. I avoided it for the first time I lived in Seattle, but now I've come back.
Yeah, I think that actually, it's a little bit off subject, but I think that story that you talk about, I know some of the folks on the CBL Mariner team, right? A lot of these folks are like, yeah, I never would have done it, but the right opportunity came along and open source in it, and the culture has changed that they're willing to do it. Now, I do know some are like, well, I'm going to try it and see how it's going, right? Yeah, they want to see us live walk the walk, or I'm sorry, walk the talk. But I think it's great to see people like yourself coming in and driving us forward, continually driving us forward.
I'm at almost 4 years, and when I showed up, I was like, I'll give it a year. We'll see what it looks like. But there's still so much opportunity to change and so much excitement and passion to make that change. If it was just opportunity, that's different. But there is clear business direction that this needs to shift because the industry has shifted. And so we need to do this. And that just fits so well and resonates so well with my lifelong passion of working in open source.
Awesome. Great. Well, thank you again, Sarah, for coming back on. Appreciate it.
Yeah, happy to.
Thank you.
Bye now.